She walked into that courthouse like any other woman, quiet, unnoticed, but within minutes, the entire room would realize they had just mocked the director of the FBI. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, and what happened next? Share your story in the comments. Angela Brooks stepped out of a dusty silver sedan onto the cracked asphalt of the Fairfield County Courthouse parking lot, her navy blue suit catching the lazy Kentucky sun in muted flashes. She looked every bit the part of an ordinary citizen, no detail flashy enough to draw a second glance. No entourage, no flashing lights, just one woman blending into the background of a town that hadn't changed much in 40 years. Angela understood the unspoken rules of places like this, where appearance often mattered more than truth, and reputation traveled faster than facts ever could. Leaning casually against the courthouse's faded brick wall, two deputies noticed her approach, and with a lazy smirk, one elbowed the other, muttering under his breath, "Another one, looking to beg mercy." "Probably," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Angela heard it all, every smug syllable carried easily through the thick afternoon heat, but she didn't break stride. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old coffee and floor polish. A sad battle waged by an ancient ceiling fan turning slow and hopeless above the lobby. Angela paused a beat just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The security desk, staffed by two uniformed men who barely glanced at her before waving her through with a grunt. No ID check, no clipboard. Just a dismissive nod, like she was another background character in a story they thought they already knew. Her low heels clicked lightly against the yellowed tile as she passed bulletin boards cluttered with faded wanted posters, bake sale flyers, and long-forgotten jury summonses curling at the edges like neglected leaves. She moved with the stillness of someone who knew the weight of patience, someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of listening before striking. Angela found courtroom 2B, with ease, the door slightly ajar. The voices inside lazy and careless, slipping quietly onto a back bench. She tucked her hands neatly into her lap and waited, watched, listened. Near the front, a handful of sheriff's deputies lounged, their boots scuffing the wooden floor, their laughter sharp and thoughtless. "Bet she's here for unpaid parking tickets," one joked, nudging his buddy with the thumb aimed squarely at Angela without shame. Another snickered. "Or maybe a custody case. Looks like the type," he added, loud enough for half the room to hear. Angela's face remained a perfect mask of polite neutrality. But inside, she was cataloging every insult, every dismissive laugh, every sneer tossed so casually by men who believed no one important could possibly be watching. Their arrogance filled the room heavier than the Kentucky humidity pressing against the old windows, and they had no idea how badly they were about to regret it. The courtroom air grew heavier as more people drifted in, the creaking of the wooden benches mixing with low murmurs and the occasional impatient sigh. Angela remained seated at the back, her presence small and deliberate, her eyes never lingering too long on any one face, yet somehow missing nothing. The deputies near the front kept up their little performance, nudging each other, whispering crude jokes under their breath, each comment peeling back another layer of their assumptions like an onion that stung no one but themselves. "She's probably got a sob story ready to go," one said, loud enough for the entire left side of the room to hear. The others chuckled, their laughter bouncing off the cracked plaster walls as if this courthouse belonged to them and them alone. Angela shifted slightly in her seat, crossing one leg over the other with a grace that seemed to mock their assumptions without ever needing a word. Outside the dusty windows, the heavy Kentucky sun slanted longer shadows across the parking lot, turning every crack in the concrete into a dark line leading nowhere fast. Inside, it was a different kind of heat, the simmering arrogance of men too sure of their own superiority, too lazy to imagine consequences. Another deputy, younger, nervously fingering the edge of his badge, leaned toward the thick-set one who had made the worst jokes and muttered, "Reckon she'll start crying when the judge throws the book at her. Ehem." The thick-set one snorted so hard it made a woman 2 benches over turn and frown. But still, nobody said anything. Not yet. Angela didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes, didn't so much as blink out of rhythm. She knew patience better than any of them knew pride. She wasn't here to scold them or even to shame them, not yet. She was here to see them for who they truly were when they thought no one of value was watching. It was an old habit, honed over years in interrogation rooms and boardrooms alike, perfected over 1,000 encounters where she had let others underestimate her while she took their full measure. The jokes kept coming, more vulgar now, less careful, fueled by the assumption that nobody in the room mattered, nobody would remember, and certainly nobody would hold them accountable. One even pulled out his phone, flashing a meme at his buddies, a crude cartoon mocking a woman who looked suspiciously like Angela herself. Exaggerated features drawn in cruel strokes under the caption, "Court Clown of the Day." They laughed harder at that one. The kind of laughter that wasn't just dismissive but dehumanizing. The kind that stripped dignity and fed on it like vultures on a roadside carcass. Angela's hands remained neatly folded in her lap, her face an unreadable mask, but her mind recorded every sneer, every snicker, every careless cruelty that drifted toward her across the warped oak floorboards. They thought they were untouchable, insulated by uniforms and habits that had gone unchecked for years, maybe decades. In towns like this where justice was often more about who you knew than what was right, what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that every smirk, every whispered slur was already weaving the noose tighter around their own necks. They didn't know that the woman they mocked was not just some lost soul wandering into court for a bad check or a petty charge. They didn't know that the woman sitting so quietly, so small in her plain blue suit, had more power in her little finger than they could muster with every badge and boot in that room combined. Outside, the flag hung limp on the old pole, the colors faded, the promise it once symbolized forgotten by too many inside. But Angela Brooks remembered it well, and she knew that before the day was over, so would they. The bailiff shuffled into place near the judge's entrance, tapping his clipboard lightly against his palm to signal that court was about to come into session. Conversations fell into hasty whispers, papers shuffled faster, and the laughter from the deputies dried up like a creek bed in July, leaving only awkward glances and tight throats. Angela shifted her posture slightly, straightening her back and folding her hands neatly atop her knee, her calm presence untouched by the sudden nervous energy crackling through the room. "All rise," the bailiff barked with mechanical authority, and everyone stood, benches groaning under the weight of shifting bodies. Judge Benjamin Reed entered through a side door, an old man with a worn black robe and an even warier expression. His footsteps slow but deliberate. He took his seat behind the towering bench, peering over thick spectacles as he surveyed the room like a schoolmaster taking roll call in a classroom full of troublemakers. "Be seated," he said, his voice roughened by decades of smoking and small-town courtrooms. The room obeyed with a collective rustle of denim and polyester. Angela remained perfectly poised, her eyes lowered just slightly as if to continue playing the role they expected of her, silent, small, inconsequential. But the trap was already set. And they had walked straight into it. Judge Reed cleared his throat, shuffling through a stack of papers before glancing up again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if tasting something sour in the air. "Before we begin today's docket," he said slowly, "there's a visitor in our courtroom you all ought to know about." Notice the deputies shifted uncomfortably on the side benches, their boots scuffing against the scuffed tile. Angela could feel them trying to figure out what was coming, but their imaginations didn't stretch far enough to save them. "Miss Angela Brooks is here today," Judge Reed continued, each word falling like a hammer onto an anvil. "On behalf of the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." A ripple went through the courtroom, the kind that starts in the gut before it ever shows on a man's face. The same deputies who had spent the last half hour building a wall of mockery around her now looked like they were swallowing nails. Angela stood quietly, smoothing the front of her navy blazer. and turned to face the room for the first time fully. Her presence, small as it had seemed, now filled every inch of that courthouse. The deputies, the clerks, the lawyers, every set of eyes locked onto her and stayed there. She's conducting an independent observation, the judge added, tapping his gavel once for emphasis. In light of recent complaints filed against county personnel and procedures, but the room grew impossibly still. One of the younger deputies, the one who had made the nastiest jokes, turned the color of spoiled milk, tugging at the collar of his uniform as if it were suddenly too tight to breathe. Angela let the silence stretch a few seconds longer before giving a small nod, her face serene, composed, yet carrying the weight of every story that had brought her here today. The deputies didn't dare whisper now. Even the scraping of a pen against paper sounded too loud. Too guilty. Outside the courtroom, a summer breeze stirred the limp American flag back to life for a moment. The faded red, white, and blue snapping once in the hot air like an ancient promise remembered too late. Angela didn't need to speak to reclaim the ground they had trampled. Her very presence had already redrawn the lines they thought were theirs to control. In that charged moment, as she sat back down with the deliberate calm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, Angela Brooks became something they could no longer ignore, no longer laugh away, no longer treat like a ghost passing through their world. She had come not just to observe, but to bear witness, and now there was nowhere left for them to hide. The court recessed for a short break after the opening announcements, but no one truly relaxed. Angela remained seated, her posture unchanging. While around her the courtroom shifted with restless energy, deputies gathered near the side exit whispering low and fast, exchanging glances thick with panic and regret, each man realizing in real time that casual cruelty had consequences they hadn't imagined facing. Angela watched them without staring, her gaze soft but unwavering, recording every twitch of guilt, every nervous laugh that died halfway in their throats. The older deputy, who had made the cruelest jokes earlier, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, his bravado collapsing like a paper tent in the rain. Outside the courthouse windows, a dusty breeze stirred the magnolia trees lining the parking lot, the petals fluttering against the glass like nature itself demanding attention. Inside, however, it was all forced calm, as if pretending nothing had happened could erase the cameras, the witnesses, or the memory of how freely they had spoken. Angela's mind worked quietly but relentlessly, already outlining her report, not with malice, but with a clarity sharpened by years of seeing the same scenes play out again and again. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability, the kind that didn't come cheap, the kind that demanded names, dates, patterns. She glanced at the cracked ceiling tiles above her, the way the old courthouse bore the weight of its years without apology, and thought how fitting it was that the building itself seemed more honest than the men who worked within its walls. When the bailiff returned to announce the session would resume, his voice cracked slightly over the loudspeaker, betraying a nervousness that no amount of sternness could cover. Angela stood slowly, gathering her notebook and adjusting her blazer with deliberate grace. As she moved toward the front row where the judge had instructed her to sit, conversations stopped altogether. The deputies averted their eyes like schoolboys caught misbehaving. Their earlier swagger evaporated into thin, brittle silence. Judge Reed entered again, this time without his usual sluggishness. His eyes flicked to Angela and then quickly back to his docket, as if reminding himself not to misstep. He cleared his throat, shuffled some papers unnecessarily, and called the next case a misdemeanor assault involving a local bar fight. The first witness was a woman with a tight bun and tired eyes, a waitress who had seen too much for too little pay. As she spoke, Angela kept one ear on the testimony and one on the subtle shiftings among the deputies. They sat stiffer now, breathing quieter, their bodies telegraphing tension with every twitch of a shoulder, every unnecessary cough. They knew their words had betrayed them, had stripped bare the culture they'd had hidden behind badges and bureaucratic indifference. Angela took small, careful notes not just of what the witness said, but of who leaned forward with interest, who slumped low, trying to disappear, who avoided looking at her entirely. In a place like this, silence screamed louder than words. As the witness finished and the defense lawyer fumbled with his cross-examination, Angela turned her attention to the prosecutor's table. The young assistant district attorney, a wiry man with nervous energy, kept darting glances toward her, as if seeking silent reassurance he wasn't next in line for scrutiny. Angela allowed herself a fraction of a nod, barely perceptible. But enough. Not every soul here was rotten. Some simply needed reminding that justice wasn't an act. It was a habit, cultivated or destroyed with every small choice. Outside the courtroom, life went on as usual, cars rolling past, children laughing at nothing in particular. But inside, change was already clawing its way into the cracks. Unavoidable now, unstoppable. And Angela Brooks, seated with quiet authority and a notebook that weighed heavier than any badge in that room, was just getting started. When the recess ended and the hearing resumed, the courthouse felt different. Not quieter, exactly, but heavier. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Angela Brooks sat poised near the front, her notebook resting lightly on her lap. Every detail from the past hour etched into her memory as clearly as ink on the page. Judge Reed cleared his throat again, a nervous tick he hadn't been able to shake since Angela had entered the room. He announced the next case, a minor dispute about zoning violations, something that would normally pass unnoticed. But today, every word, every glance, carried double the weight. Angela watched as the prosecutors stumbled slightly over introductions, their voices tight, their hands clenching their papers a little too hard. At the side benches, the deputies who had once lounged and joked now sat like statues, their boots tapping an anxious staccato against the linoleum. It would have been almost pitiable if it hadn't been so deserved. Angela wasn't here to destroy lives. She was here to hold up a mirror and let them see the cracks they had long denied. As the case dragged through tedious exhibits and tired arguments, Angela's gaze never wavered. She noticed the deputy with the faded tattoo wiping his palms against his trousers again and again, noticed how another one young, barely out of the academy, kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. They weren't used to being watched, really watched. And it showed. About halfway through the proceedings, Judge Reed asked the court to allow Director Brooks to address a procedural matter. There was a ripple through the room, not loud, but unmistakable, as Angela rose smoothly and stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, a steady counterpoint to the sudden surge of nervous energy pressing in around her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, measured, impossible to ignore. "I respectfully request to make a formal statement for the record, pertaining to courthouse conduct observed today." The judge hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the cluster of deputies like a man calculating the weight of a boulder about to drop. "Proceed," he said finally, his voice cracking, just slightly. Angela turned to face the room, not with aggression, not with condescension, but with the steady gravity of someone who understood exactly what power was and what it wasn't. She didn't need to shout or threaten. Her very presence was enough. "It has become clear," she said, "that certain members of law enforcement present today have demonstrated behavior unbecoming of the duties they are sworn to uphold. Behavior that, if left unchecked, corrodes public trust and undermines the very fabric of justice we are here to protect." The silence was suffocating, thicker than the humid Kentucky air outside. Angela let the words settle, not rushing, not filling the space with unnecessary noise. "This courthouse," she continued, "is not merely a building. It is a symbol. And symbols must be guarded with more than arrogance and tradition. They must be guarded with integrity." A murmur ran through the public seating area, a low rustle like dry leaves on pavement. The deputies shifted again, some red-faced, some pale, none daring to meet her gaze. Angela didn't need to call out names. The guilty already knew who they were. She nodded once, sharply, and returned to her seat, her every step measured, dignified, deliberate. Judge Reed fumbled with his papers, hastily moving on to the next docket item. But it was clear no one was paying real attention. The hearing limped on, technically still alive. But the soul of the room had changed. Angela Brooks had tilted the axis just enough, and the tremors were only beginning. After the hearing adjourned for the day, Angela Brooks didn't rush to leave. She gathered her things with quiet precision, feeling the weight of dozens of stolen glances prickling at her back. She could sense the ripple effect already, the nervous shuffling of boots, the hurried whispers between officers, the anxious pacing of court clerks who realized, too late, that the old rules no longer applied. Outside in the marble hallway, the late afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows, painting long shadows across the cracked floors. Angela walked steadily down the corridor, her badge tucked away, her authority invisible but undeniable. Behind her, a cluster of deputies lingered near the bulletin board, pretending to study outdated community announcements, their conversation little more than tight, panicked murmurs. She caught a few phrases, half-whispered desperation seeping through the plaster walls. What if they audit the old cases, one deputy hissed, his voice cracking. They'll find everything. Another cut him off sharply. Shut up. Man, she's still here. Angela didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Fear had already rooted itself deep in their bones. And fear, she knew, was a better teacher than any lecture could ever be. As she exited through the courthouse doors, a small group of townspeople stood gathered across the street, not protesting, not shouting, just watching, their faces solemn, cautious, curious. Angela paused for a brief moment at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the weight of their eyes meet hers. No grand speeches, no handshakes for the cameras, just a silent acknowledgement that change had cracked the surface of Fairfield County, and there was no patching it back the old way. She stepped off the final stair and made her way to her car, the gravel crunching under her heels like a slow, steady drumbeat. As she unlocked the door, a voice called out, hesitant but clear. Ma'am. She turned to see a woman approaching, mid-30s maybe, hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, wearing a plain denim jacket and jeans. In her hands, she clutched a folded piece of paper so tightly it was beginning to tear at the edges. The woman stammered, glancing back toward the courthouse as if afraid of being seen. I just wanted to say, thank you. Nobody's ever come here and made them scared before. Angela offered a small, genuine smile. Taking the paper without a word, the woman nodded once, her eyes glassy, and hurried away before anyone else could notice. Angela slid into the driver's seat, unfolding the paper slowly. Inside was a short, shaking handwritten note. Please don't forget about us. They'll just go back to how it was if you leave. She folded it carefully, sliding it into the breast pocket of her suit. Close to her heart, the engine rumbled to life, but Angela didn't pull away immediately. She sat for a long moment, watching the courthouse grow smaller in her rearview mirror, and made a silent promise this wasn't going to end with a few suspensions and whispered apologies. Real change took more than fear. It needed light. It needed truth. And above all, it needed people willing to stay even when it got messy. She adjusted the mirror, squared her shoulders, and drove off into the deepening blue of the Kentucky evening. Not away from the fight, but deeper into it. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of everything Fairfield County thought it could hide. Federal investigators didn't storm in with flashing lights or loud accusations. They moved like a steady current, pulling at the loose threads of a broken system until entire seams came apart. Angela Brooks remained at the center of it all, not making speeches, not holding press conferences, just doing the work calm, relentless, undeniable one by one. Citizens who once felt invisible began stepping forward. A retired janitor, voice shaking, described how he'd been stopped and questioned 6 times in a single year for walking home after midnight. A high school coach detailed how players from the wrong side of town were ticketed more harshly than others. A mother wept as she told the story of her son, pulled over for a broken taillight and ending up in a holding cell for 2 days without being allowed a call. The stories poured out like water behind a crumbling dam. Angela sat through every testimony, every accusation, every tear-streaked confession. Her pen scratching quietly across notepads that would later build cases stronger than any threat could ever achieve. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the remaining deputies walked on eggshells, their laughter silenced, their swagger replaced by nervous glances and stiff, robotic movements. The ones who had mocked most viciously were the first to file for early retirement. A few tried transferring to neighboring counties, hoping distance might erase their pasts. It wouldn't. Angela made sure the findings were shared across jurisdictions, ensuring that no one who abused their power could simply disappear into another badge. Real consequences were coming, not just suspensions but criminal referrals, federal oversight, mandatory reforms. By the second month, the old courthouse felt almost hollow, like a stage abandoned by actors who finally realized the audience wasn't laughing with them anymore. Angela attended a community meeting one Thursday night, held in the same dusty auditorium where old political rallies once blared about law and order. Now it was packed with local families, veterans, students, shop owners, people who had learned the hard way that silence buys you nothing but more silence. When Angela stepped to the front, she didn't bring fireworks or promises she couldn't keep. She brought honesty. This town, she said, her voice low but resonant, will be judged not by the mistakes that were made, but by how you choose to respond to them now. Real change isn't about tearing each other down. It's about building something no one ever thought was possible here. Real fairness. Real justice. The crowd was quiet, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of quiet that meant people were listening, truly listening. Maybe for the first time. After the meeting ended, a boy no older than 12 approached her shyly, holding a crumpled notebook. "Ma'am," he said, looking up at her with wide brown eyes. "I want to be like you someday. I want to make bad people scared to hurt good people." Angela crouched down to meet his gaze head on. She smiled gently and said, "You won't need to scare them. Son, you'll just need to show them you're not afraid anymore." He grinned. And in that grin, Angela saw the future she had been fighting for, not headlines, not revenge, but a small seed of courage planted in the heart of a town that had finally remembered what dignity was supposed to look like. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the courthouse bathed in the soft gold of a setting sun behind her. Angela knew the fight wasn't over, but it was no longer hers alone to carry, and for the first time in a long, long while, that was enough.